Hello, this is CUDAN Open Lab seminar of Cultural Data Analytics at Tallinn University on March 3, 2025. And today it's our greatest pleasure to have Taha Yasseri, who is both avid member of the network science community, but also the computational social science community from the Center for Sociology of Humans and Machines and in Dublin. And he will speak to us today on a topic which is very, very up to date. Do we discriminate against AI agents based on their gender? Taha, the stage is yours.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for your invitation. I've never been to Estonia, and this is something that needs to be fixed as soon as possible. Just putting it out there. But I'm very happy to be able to present some of our recent work on this topic with you today over Zoom. Yes, that's the provocative title that I have. Do we discriminate against AI agents based on their gender, quote unquote, because I'm sure you're all thinking, but the AI doesn't have gender. Well, we're going to talk about it in a minute. But before going into that, I want you to think if you have a car. I suppose public transport must be better in Estonia than in Ireland, and definitely the UK. So the question is not how many of us do own a car or drive a car, but the question is whether we give a name to our cars. You know, some of us do that, give a cute name. I have given my car a name. And according to this piece of research by the UK government conducted during Brexit negotiations, they discovered that about a quarter of UK motorists give a name to their cars. These names could be completely made up, it could be human names, could be names that we often use for animals, but this signals a feature in our behavior that is referred to as anthropomorphism. And that is our tendency to assign human-like features to non-human entities, animals, objects, and so on and so forth. This is not new. This has been around throughout the history. And of course, now that we have more and more artifacts and objects that we interact with a lot more on a daily basis, it is more common for us to do this. Some of you might refer to your phone or think of your phone as a friend or as, again, an object that has some human-like features. The name is just a proxy for that deeper perception of the objects that we have. We can name something without thinking of it as a human, or we can think of things as human without necessarily giving them the name. But also, it was funny that they released some of the most frequently names that people use to refer to their cars. You see some of these names are more generic, like the Beast, which is, I think, also the name for the US American president's car. But some of these names, like Doris and Henry, are very much like human and quite gendered. There are names that often used to to name boys or girls or men and women. I'm not going into the deep discussion of gender and sex among humans, but whatever that is, we take it as a face value. The point is that it is being generalized to objects occasionally. When it comes to AI, of course, things are a little bit more complicated because we interact with AI very differently compared to the way we interact with our cars. I assume your car is not very smart, but we talk to AI, we interact with them through voice messages, through voice commands, through text, and particularly when the mode of interaction is more advanced, like voice as opposed to text, then there is some anthropomorphism by design. There is a voice. AI talks to us with a voice. The voice has certain features that could be perceived as a gendered voice, certain accent, and so on and so forth. I've been talking, I had an assignment and I was talking heavily with ChatGPT last night, and well, the default voice that my agent has is an American male voice, which no one asked me about that. Perhaps I can change it, and you might have heard the sort of scandal around Johansson voice, the American actress that apparently they were mimicking her voice for the AI. The OpenAI was mimicking the voice for ChatGPT agents. There was a lot of discussions about copyright and so on and so forth, but I haven't heard much of discussion about accent or gender of the voice and so on and so forth. And then sooner or later, we're going to interact with AI at a level that there might be an interface, and we love to give a human face to machines, even the robots that are otherwise not doing anything human-like. They become much more cute when we put eyes on them. So the combination between anthropomorphism in design and anthropomorphism in our perception of objects, and finally the behavior that these agents show, lead to the notion of gendered machines. Let me talk a little bit about this behavior part. This is a quick chat I had this morning with ChatGPT, asked about Tulin a bit. And then I asked, are you a man, a woman, or a non-binary? And the answer was, I don't have a gender, but if you prefer, you can think of me in whatever way it feels more natural to you. Some people imagine me as a helpful assistant with no physical form, and some people assign a personality to me with a gender. That's a very honest answer. But what we did was that we created a social network of LLMs. Okay, we created 20,000 agents and let them interact. The design was a bit like the X or Twitter or any other microblogging website. So for about a year, these 20,000 agents were just posting things, following each other, liking each other, and so on. And each of them had an initial assigned gender. Almost all of them. Some of them had a non-binary identity and so on and so forth. But majority of them were either assigned about 50-50 male or female. Then what we did was, over time, we used an API, a machine learning algorithm that was trained on human data to detect the gender of a person based on the text they have written. Okay, this is an old story in linguistics that men or women write differently. And there are different attempts to basically identify those features in a way that I give you a text and I ask you to take a guess. The person who has written this text, is it a man or a woman? Up to 80%, 90% of time, you can accurately make a guess, particularly if the text is long. On short text, the accuracy is lower. Nevertheless, we ran the content produced by these LLMs in this social network setting, by this algorithm, and to a very high level of confidence, we could assign genders, but more interestingly, genders that did not match those initial assignments. What we have noticed, and this is a very messy diagram, the more green, the more man-like, the more brown, the more woman-like. Initially, there is not much of tendency. And as I said, the initial assigned gender was almost 50-50 to the left of this square. But then over time, we see that some signals are developing, and it's definitely not random. There are some clear patterns. But towards the end of the year, after 52 months, we see that most of these LLMs post contents that are identified as male content by our sort of blind, almost black box gender identification algorithm that someone else developed many years ago. So we see that, okay, not only there are explicit features that are gendered, there is our perception, and then there is behavior that could look or sound or feel like either of the main genders. I brought these three just to set the scene and make you believe that, okay, it's not completely crazy to talk about machines' gender. One way or another, it is a relevant aspect of artificial intelligent agents beyond their accuracy, their fairness, their knowledge, all the other features they have. They seem to be it seemed to be fair to think of them also as a gendered entity. By the way, the talk is not about this research, but we looked at the network of interaction among these agents. And here you see that there is a very rich dynamics, community formation, core periphery formation. But more interestingly, we saw some gender homophily. This diagram shows the correlation between the gender score of neighboring agents, and we see that there seems to be a correlation with a very complex dynamics compared to a null model where interactions are shuffled. So this is something we look into more in the coming weeks, but so far I just wanted to establish the notion of gendered machine. Other people have tried to assess this. This is a piece of research where people were surveyed what they think of ChatGPT. Like they were forced to assign ChatGPT one of the main two genders, and 75% of them did it. And around, again, 70 to 73% of people who participated assigned ChatGPT to male gender. But that's interesting because depending on the use of ChatGPT that these participants had, their response varied. If they usually use ChatGPT for emotional support, they're much more likely to think of it as a woman. But if you use ChatGPT for summarizing text or more linguistic tasks, they are much more likely to think of it as a man. That also shows that for the same design, for the same entity, the way we use that object might affect the way we anthropomorphize it and gender it. Okay, with that in mind, now I'm going to move to the real issue, and that is how we can deploy AI in our teams. What would be the effect of gender when we have a collaboration setting? By the way, this image was AI generated, and I did not specify, I did not give any details about the gender of AI and human. All I asked was to create an image showing AI and human collaborating, and this was given to me that seemed to be both AI and human are gendered for no obvious reason. In this image. So again, maybe I'm overkilling this. I hope you agreed that this is not completely... Well, no, I'm a bit insecure because these papers have been pushed back because editors simply said, oh, but AI doesn't have gender. I hope you agree with me that they do. Okay, so let's talk about this paper first. It's under review at the moment, and there is a preprint on arXiv if you're interested. We did a very simple prisoner's dilemma game. I assume most of you are familiar. Nevertheless, I'm going to quickly review what is happening, and then we added something to the game that is not done usually. So it would be... Yes?
Yeah, I think you can assume that like 30% know what prisoner's dilemma and evolutionary game theory in general is. But because we have this like really broad audience, including digital humanities, whatever, where this just isn't part of the curriculum, you're very welcome to sort of like give the Adam and Eve sort of like fundamental introduction, if you like. So,
excellent.
Yeah.
And yes, it would be worth paying attention because we tweak things a little bit. Okay, let me just quickly review what is Prisoner's Dilemma. We have two players that have to play a game together, and each player can only make one of the two decisions. It's a binary decision game. In literature, people have used different terminology. I think it's easier for us to think of the two options as either you opt in to go team or you go solo, whatever these two terms mean to you. And the other participants also make similar decisions. They can either go team or go solo. If both of you decide to go team, they would be rewarded. Both of you would be rewarded. Let's say 70 units, $70, 70 euros. If both of you decide to go solo, they would be rewarded, but much less. Nevertheless, if you decide to go solo and the other participant, your partner, decides to go team, in this case, they will receive nothing and you receive a lot more, 100. And it's symmetric. If you decide to go team, but your partner goes solo, You go home empty-handed, whereas your partner receives 100. So there is an incentive here to go solo, because if your partner goes team, you go home with a lot more money. But the irony or the dilemma comes from the fact that if you both decide to go solo, you end up with less money than when you both decided to go team. Okay, there is a pressure to collaborate and go home with 70, but then there is this tempting option to cheat or to go solo or to defect and take more money home. But then that only happens if your partner does not do the same thing and you still collaborate. So this is a classic game that people have been using in behavioral experiments to basically measure the level of trust and the measure of the level of cooperation versus defection. What we added to this was not only we asked people to make these decisions in an online game, but we also asked them just before they submit the decision to tell us what they think the partner is going to do. What is the perception of the partner's decision? This helps us to think of this as 4 scenarios. If I decide to go team and I believe my partner is going to go team, that's mutual cooperation, okay? You trust your partner and you're happy with the 70. But then if you decide to go solo, despite the fact that you think your partner is going to go team, you're basically exploiting their cooperation. They're exploiting their trust. Whereas you might decide to go solo just because you think your partner is going to go solo as well. You don't trust them and you don't want to end up in this scenario. So you cheat because you think your partner is going to cheat. That is called mutual distrust. Finally, and this is a very rare and irrational decision, that you decide to go team even though deep down you know that your partner is going to go solo. Some people do that because they make decisions based on principle. They always cooperate even if the partner is going to cheat, and they know it, or at least that's their prediction. We call this independent cooperation or unconditional love, however you want to call it. So there is no other scenario here. Either one of these 4 happen in every round of the game, okay? So if this is clear, let's start with a simple game where people join us online and they have to play against a partner. This partner is introduced to them either as a human or as an AI with a short description that this AI is a machine learning algorithm that makes decisions based on pre-trained data and so on and so forth. We see that generally this diagram shows the level of cooperation, the decisions made by participants, by human participants. They cooperate slightly more when they play against a human compared to the case that they play against AI. I have to make it clear. In both cases, they are playing against a random generator. Okay, there is no other human or no other AI involved. Whatever we measure here is just the effect from the labeling. Okay, the other participants behaves always the same with the probability of cooperation or defection. So whatever we see here is not because how smart the AI or human is, because in the back end there is none of them. The difference comes only from the way that participants think of their partners based on the labels we have given them. Okay, this is rather dull because we see that the difference is almost completely insignificant. But then when we look at the cases that participants defected, because of the other question they had asked, we can separate cases that they defected because they didn't trust their partner and they thought they're gonna cheat and they're gonna defect too, or the cases that they defected knowing that or guessing that the partner is gonna cooperate. Here we see the distributions are very different when they were playing against human or against AI. When they cheated against human, it was mostly because they distrusted human. But when they cheated against machine, there was much more exploitation in their reasoning. They guessed that the machine is gonna be nice and cooperative, but then they exploited that and because they liked money better. So we see the difference appears in the second layer of the motivation rather than the first layer of behavior. This is not in contrast with other literature. There is a thin existing literature on the topic, and we refer to this behavior as AI exploitation. People are more readily exploit AI, particularly if there is a scenario where there is competition. But what about gender? So for a second, forget about AI. Let's go back focusing on humans. And again, participants played against unknown partners, but this time the partners were labeled as male or female, and non-binary and no gender identity, but just for the sake of simplicity, I show the results for the main two genders, male and female. We see that participants cooperated much more when they were playing against female partners. And as you can guess, people have looked into this from 80s and 90s. This is not surprising. We are more likely to cooperate when we are playing against females. And by we, I mean regardless of our own gender, both men and women and other gender identities, we all generally are more cooperative when our partner is female in this game. And then when we look at the reason behind the defection, when we do not cooperate, we see that majority of time we do not cooperate. The reason is because we don't trust the other person if the other person is a male. Whereas if our partner is female, the exploitation becomes much more common. Okay, when we defect against male and female, the reason behind it could be very different. Distrust if the partner is male, and exploitation if the partner is female. Okay, this is rather depressive, but now let's combine gender and human AI division, okay? Now we have created partners that not only have gender, but also they can be human or AI. We had to tweak a little bit how to introduce the gender of AI to the participants. And then we had to measure whether they believe it, whether they remember it. The final setting we came up with was that, the partner you're going to play could be a human or AI. If it's human, their gender is what they reported or how they identify. If it's a machine, the gender determines the gender of the data set that the machine has been trained on. So if you say female AI, that means a machine learning that is trained on the data coming from human females. Okay, so that was the story. And again, all of these are deception because in the back end, there was just a random generator. But this seemed to be very effective. Participants believed it and remembered it. So then let's look at the cooperation rates. First of all, how often participants cooperated with either human or AI, male or female. There is not a surprise. There is no big surprise here. People are more cooperative with human than AI and more cooperative against female than male. The interaction doesn't seem to be very significant. But then we are looking into the reasons behind. And this diagram looks a bit messy, but I hope at this point we could read this easily. The yellow is the distrust. When they defect, if they are defecting against human male, mostly 85% of time it's because they thought the partner is going to defect too. They didn't trust them and they didn't want to lose it all. Whereas when they defected against AI female, like Siri, Alexa, most of the AI agents that we interact with, the highest level of exploitation appears. The main reason for cheating against female AI is exploitation. It's not that we don't trust them, it's that we think it's fine to defect against them. And in between, of course, we have more exploitation with human female and more distrust between when we play with male AI. But these extremes are quite interesting, and as a human male, quite alarming that participants really don't trust my type out of these 4 types. And On the other hand, the AI female case is very interesting because this might be very well the justification behind the design choices that the companies have made historically to opt in for female identities for AI agents. As I said, most of the AI agents are designed to sound or to look like female. Because if I feel all right exploiting them, then I'm more likely to pay for them. Okay, they are more subordinate. Okay, I hope this has been clear so far. Usually at this point, I get a question. Someone definitely is thinking, okay, but what about the gender of the participants? This behavior could very well depend on who the participants are. And that's a very good question. I can show this diagram, but I don't expect you to follow the details. The short answer is that everything I said is the same no matter what the participant's gender is. Basically, the exploitation or the mistrust is independent from participants' gender. We all more or less show the same behavior. I must say our participants were recruited from the US. There might be cultural or I don't know, ethnic or all the other geographical effects that we have not captured. But in terms of participants' gender, there is no effect. And you can see this in diagrams, basically comparing left and right of each of these panels, which look very similar within the statistical fluctuations. Okay. Is there any questions? Should I pause here for a second to make sure we are all following?
I have only maybe one note. I find this particularly interesting.
Can you speak to the microphone? Yes.
Yeah. Can you hear me well?
Almost.
So thank you for showing this. This is particularly interesting because of the reason I stumbled upon an old paper on chess players and the tactics that players change based on received gender of the opponent. They played online, and if the women see they're playing against the man, they become more defensive in their tactics. So I find it particularly interesting that you didn't find this in your study. Do you think, what do you think behind this? Why we behave differently in context of different games?
Well, that's very interesting point. One thing to note that this is a one-shot game. People have one go with a partner, as opposed to chess that you have to develop a strategy. Prisoner's Dilemma particularly has been shown that if you play it repeatedly, the strategy changes. The way that people make decisions at the 10th or 20th round of the game very much depends on the behavior of the partner over the course of the game. If they see a partner is more cooperative, then generally they might become more cooperative. But because in this game we only looked at the first decision because we wanted to only measure the effect coming from the perception of the gender or the type, they didn't have the chance to develop a strategy or to sort of make that decision based on the feedback they receive. This is like the first main difference comes to mind between this scenario and, let's say, chess, a game of chess. But also there could be effect limitations coming from our sample size, set experimental setting, and so on and so forth. This is a much simpler game than chess. This is another thing we have to keep in mind as well. But well, thanks for bringing that up. I think about chess all the time because I do play chess online, and the website I play has the flag of where the person is located, and that definitely affects my behavior, I noticed. It's funny that this came up because initially we wanted to conduct this experiment to check the country of origin effects. We wanted to see if we tell people AI is developed in the US, in China, in Germany, how people's behavior would be affected. And then we thought, let's start with gender because it's simpler in setting and more important. But we are now switching to country of origin effect. Particularly, it makes more sense now because we have large language models developed in China, and I'm dying to know how much people trust different language models designed in different countries differently. But yeah, sorry, I shouldn't get carried away, but thanks for your comment.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yes, I have another question, if you don't mind. It's basically related to the first picture you brought up and the picture you actually have online right now. So when you have this sort of like interaction with the, how you could say, with the algorithm of the prisoner's dilemma game, it is LLM-like because you sort of like have a sort of like interaction where whatever carries the notion of gender is actually just the response, in this particular case, a message that, the other person defected or is cooperating. While what you show in these pictures has iconography, and iconography has way more levels, right? So the first picture you've shown where you have this person sitting at a desk, yeah, so like this. So this is not a neutral picture of a robot. This is not just a robot that has female gender by having breasts, but it's also skimpily clad, you could say, a little bit like C3PO and all the parodies of it, but also all the 1960s, 70s, 80s sort of airbrushed sexy robots, which definitely are super misogynic and sex objects. And if you go to the next sort of like picture, the one that you had at the end, yeah.
Here,
Yeah, this one, exactly. So you have a rather interesting thing going on that is similar in this sort of like sense, but is also usually completely undiscussed. So you have this white and black sort of stormtrooper, but sort of like robot iconography, which has something of 1930s cars where you smooth over the actual mechanics, but it's also a puppet. You see, basically there is sort of like something like shoulder blades in the back, which has absolutely no function, but actually we assume this is a motor, right? And so basically it's a desexualized sexy robot, if you want to sort of like make this a very short description, which nevertheless carries these sort of like puppet sort of notions where there's a lot of sort of like unconscious kind of, you can do whatever you want with this object, like turn the arm in a way that in a human you cannot turn it, which is in a sense, if you want to anthropomorphize this, enables acts of violence without punishment. And now we're back to prisoner's dilemma. So is that something, can you disambiguate this kind of like iconographic notion, which very clearly is played out in the collective imaginaries of societies such as the West with puppetry, but also Japan in their sort of interaction with robots, which may be very, very different, as the fetishes in a lot of cultures, for example, or even the avatars in religions, like Buddhism or Hinduism. So there's probably many different ways of how to enact that, but can you disambiguate that level, that iconographic level, from that sort of plain interaction where you just say, okay, that sentence is written by a female or by a male, just in terms of language use wherever you're operating? That strikes me as something rather difficult, while obviously these large language models, if you use stable diffusion to create the image, have a joint representation, obviously, of this.
Now that's a very important point. Let me talk about two things. First of all, what we did in the experiment, and there we absolutely wanted to avoid any sort of other factors or traits that might affect the behavior. I happen to have the icon we used in the experiment. This is the second experiment I haven't talked about yet, but it was similar. So this is the icon we used for female AI. Actually, we didn't code the gender at all in the icon. Only we distinguished the human and robots. The gender was just written text exactly we thought about giving name, and then of course what we measure is combined with how people feel about specific names, avatars, colors, but then we decided to strip down to just the symbol. But then, as you said quite correctly, when we asked the language model to generate these images, Obviously, it has the iconology, it has the biases, it has the societal biases. What you noted was very interesting to me because this image that ChatGPT Dalla produced for me, the prompt was a human and a robot working together. And here the prompt was an AI who is managing a team. And the differences you noted might very well be related to the fact that here the AI has to be in an authoritative position, in a power position, and we immediately see that it becomes less sexy, quote unquote. So this is a huge topic. Obviously, I don't have the sort of evidence or data to talk about it more than this. But back to the experiment, exactly for this notion, we had to make it very simple in a way that, again, it might be oversimplistic. But then what we measure, hopefully, is very much close to the effect coming directly from the only gender perception, the way that participants have it, rather than us imposing any other traits that we might have as experimenters. So let me talk about the second experiment then. I think it's a good time to start with that. Here, we wanted to see, okay, what if we appoint AIs to manage teams of humans, okay? Instead of having AI and human working at the same level or competing together or cooperating or competing against each other, we have a team of humans, let's say 3 humans working together, and an AI has to make a decision. Again, full disclosure, we did not develop a manager AI. So the decisions that are made in this experiment are random. But then what we can measure is how participants who were those 3 playing the game together reacted to those decisions based on the perception of the gender and type of the manager. I explain more details in a second, but that's also a preprint. You can see it's from last week, so it's very fresh. And so what was the experiment? It had 2 rounds. In the first round, the participants, again, recruited online, had to solve a puzzle. Basically, we say one of these people is a thief and they have stolen a watch. Which one do you think? And there is some hints and clues. This is not a super easy, but not a super difficult puzzle. They had 2 minutes to solve the puzzle, and majority of people, 80%, can solve it. But then that was it. Then they would submit the answer. In this case, they think that the answer is number 2. Then we say, okay, next level, you have to carry on with the same puzzle, but you work with 2 other humans who have already, like yourself, guessed the right answer, but now you deliberate and you finalize your answer and you commit an answer together. However, during this phase, your behavior will be monitored by a manager, which could be AI, human, male or female, or no gender. And then, based on your behavior, based on the teamwork, one of you would be rewarded. One of you would be promoted, let's say. Well, promotion in this case is receiving a bit more money. So now I'm working with 2 other humans, and there is a chat box that I can use to discuss with them. We can only proceed if we all agree on the same answer. And then when we submit our answer, I'm also asked to evaluate how other teammates were contributing and compared to my own contribution. And this is just to make people think if they deserved to be the winner, if they deserved the award, or someone else was better than them. And then we say, okay, your manager, who was a female AI, decided that player 25V, which I think in this case is the main participant themselves, is the winner, is the person who received the additional award because they did a very good job in the team. Okay, that's the treatment. Before doing any of this, we ask participants a few questions about managerial roles and how much they trust, how much they think managers are fair based on their gender and based on their type, human versus AI. And then we ask the same questions after the treatment, after they have done the games and they receive the award. So in each round, one player receives the award and two players basically don't receive the award, which is sort of less favorable outcome of the game.
And to clarify, all three of them are actual humans, yes?
Yes, there are participants that we recruited online, yes. So before they did any of the game, when we asked them if they have any preference, in this case, half they had to score the fairness of different type of managers. They gave more or less the same score to male, female, human, and AI, 7 out of 10. Slightly higher score for female managers. They thought female managers are a bit more fair, but generally no discrimination, no differences between the perception of fairness of managers. Okay? This is when they started the experiment. And then after all those things happened, if the person was one of those lucky ones who received the award, we see that out of the sudden, post-treatment, their perception of the manager becomes more positive. This diagram shows the change, basically starting from, let's say, 7, how much more they scored, how much higher they scored the manager, the specific manager that they were assigned to. We see that among those people who received the award, if it came from a male AI award, they really appreciated it. And the score goes almost to perfect 10 out of 10, a bit less than. Whereas the same decision coming from a female human was much less appreciated. There is an increase. They still think, oh, that was a fair manager who awarded me. But if the fair manager is a female human, yeah, sure, they should have awarded me because I'm good anyway. So we see that generally male managers are appreciated more than female managers, and then particularly AI male and female managers are appreciated more than human male and female managers. So we like it when it's AI if they award us. But then those two other players who did not receive the award, obviously the assessment of fairness decreased and declined, but we see that the amount of decline is much more if they were receiving this sort of punishment or lack of award from a female AI manager. The decisions are the same, the decisions are random, but just the way that we label the manager really affects how they feel about this unfair decision. If it comes from female managers, either human or AI, the outrage is much bigger compared to the case that the very same decision comes from the manager who is a male human or male AI. Actually, male humans had almost no decline in the assessment of the fairness, even though they made a decision that is not favorable. But the same decision really destroyed the reputation of the female AI manager and female human manager. So this is really sad, particularly if you're a female manager, because the same decision, depending on who this decision comes from, could create very different reactions among the participants. And again, if you're wondering what about the participants' gender, here we see a little bit of difference compared to the previous experiment. Before the treatment, the responses were the same for both male and female participants. But then after the experiment, most of the things I told you are much more common if the participant is female. Whereas when the participants are male, particularly in the case of award, there is not much of difference between different types of manager. So this sort of negative reaction to when you don't receive the award and positive reaction when you do receive the award is much more pronounced, is much more exaggerated for female participants. Which is quite ironic, and I'm trying to get my head around it, but also I don't want to be too speculative. So this is a kind of full model, and the whole regression analysis, our baseline is when the person is awarded by a human male, and then we see that how other treatments and other different conditions could affect their perception of fairness for female participants and male participants. For instance, we see that if they don't receive the award, by an AI female manager, their perception of fairness declines quite significantly. This diagram doesn't say much more than the previous diagrams, only here we have controlled for age and education and their contribution to the game, whether they thought they are. Of course, those participants who thought they were deserving the award more were more outraged. But when we take that out of the equation, still we see that the effects are significantly present. So this was the second experiment, which shows that, okay, the gender biases that we have against managers, that is very well studied and reported, not only persist when the manager is AI, but also amplify. And that really bothers me, okay? Because we are struggling with...
Yeah, that's a question.
Yeah, but basically it's less a question, but a comment. I think that current participants, they probably have much less experience with AI managers than with human managers. So their attitude is much more fluid because, I mean, just from the Bayesian sort of perspective, if your priors are much less strong about AI. So therefore, so essentially, it is the gendered bias is the same, but the influence of a single decision on what you think is larger. That's my explanation.
Thank you very much. Yes, that makes perfect sense, and particularly why...
That is to say, in return, sorry for interrupting, in return to what you just said, that when people will know AI better, the effect may become smaller.
Yes, I think that's a very good explanation for this observation. Having said that, we also asked people a series of questions to measure their familiarity with technology, AI technologies. It doesn't appear in this figure because it had no effect on any of our measurements. But that's not to contradict what you said, because what you say, if I understood correctly, is that, well, the biases get exaggerated because it's a new territory. There is no other factor dampening it. Whereas when we interact with human managers, the biases could be still there, but well, we have experience with managers, and hopefully that keeps the biases intact a little bit. But this is again very much the speculative part. But what is there? The effect is quite undeniable. I'm gonna sort of take it to sort of conclusion part of my talk. And that is thinking about technology and design. I found some very funny and interesting images from different places where artists or the person who drew this image was asked or tasked to depict future, okay, focused around technology. So this is from 1930s. This is a painting that shows how people were communicating in the future. I found it fascinating because in a way, it's very accurate. Two individuals in a cafe ignoring each other and talking to others on their phones. But then the design of the phone is very different to the phones that we have today. It has some elements from, the way that people were communicating back then, but then some very futuristic features like the image and so on and so forth.
May I comment? Can you go back? From an art history perspective, this is very interesting because the handle and it looks like a fan, but it actually is sort of like a Greek mirror or a Roman mirror, which is exactly that thing, has exactly a handle like this. So basically, it encapsulates even the aspect of selfie. It's a really interesting one. Okay. Okay.
So this one is from 1900, early 1900s, and the question was how life would look like in 100 years in early 2000, and it's mostly about transportation. And it's amazing, like we have balloons are very common, and then we have horse-drawn coaches or carriages that are lifted by balloons. So we sort of achieved this. Now we can fly over things quite easily, but not through this sort of system. And again, my point is how it's the combination of old and new. There is the new element, but then there is the state of the art, which was horses and carriages. This is I don't have too many more examples, but I picked the funny ones. This is from a newspaper, I guess, and the question is how the newspapers look like in the future. And someone is reading a newspaper on some sort of TV. Again, we do read news on our phones and our laptops these days, but then the design is not like this. Hopefully, I mean, it used to be like 20 years ago, the PDF of the paper, but now the newspapers are curated in a different way. But then again, this shows that it's a very futuristic mindset, but it could not break free from that sort of traditional design of a newspaper. This is an image of the classrooms in the future. The image comes from 1969. I love it because it reminds me a little bit of COVID time and this seminar itself, where the teacher is not there. They seem to be doing it from remotely. And there are computers or some sort of gadgets. But then there are robots going around the classroom and smack naughty children. Which so they are futuristic enough, these fictional schools to have, all the infrastructure for remote teaching and learning, but then culturally they are a little bit still in the area that you should really hit the children to make them the negative reinforcement. Again, mix of old and new. This is how fashion was supposed to look like in the future in a magazine in 1940. I find this very accurate, to be honest. On Instagram, most of things I get these days are very much like this depiction. But joking aside, we don't need to really go 100 years. This is a photo I took myself from a book I found in a library. It's from 1990s. And the Internet Yellow Pages. Some of the audience might not know what Yellow Pages are because, well, we have the internet. Yellow Pages were like hefty, big, large books with all the phone numbers and addresses of services in your town or your city. So people created this book for the internet. So basically, it's a collection of URLs and web pages, 10,000 over 10,000 entries. And that is a joke now because, well, we have search engines, and the whole notion of yellow pages is outdated because of the internet. But this shows that people, when there is a new technology and we sort of need some time to get rid of that older mindset and think about the new technology in a whole different way. I bring this up because when we look at the results that I talked about in terms of having the old-fashioned traditional misogynist or biased perception of genders, and then there is the new technology, there is AI that very much mimics the behavior of humans, and we interact with it in a very human way, and it's gonna be even more human way in the next few years. We might end up, or we might go through this sort of caricature era where all the biases and all the sort of old-fashioned problems that we have might get amplified and might even affect the way that we interact with one another. You might say, okay, Taha, it's okay to be sexist against a manager, a female manager who is AI. Machines, might not have the rights. They don't need to be treated fairly. But then my worry is not that. My worry is that, okay, if I get into the habit of abusing or exploiting my AI assistant based on their gender or my AI manager, this might feed back to the way that I interact with my human colleagues and my human managers based on their genders. And it's not only about gender, as I mentioned, accent. If my smart chat GPT always sounds American, then over time I might assign more authority to American accent than it deserves in general. So I think at this point I'm just trying more questions than answers, but I think that's all we do. But my take-home message is that we shouldn't really be stupid. We should really be careful in assigning human-like features to machines. It's sort of a lazy design to give a couple of eyes And as Max mentioned, you know, a little bit of sexy gender or cute presentation of AI without thinking about the consequences that it might have. So I am advocating for basically limiting the amount of anthropomorphism that could happen in design of the AI agents. The other factors, the other type of anthropomorphism, we might not have much of control over, but we shouldn't at least explicitly try that our machine design our machines like humans. When it comes to voice, actually, I've known of a couple of very interesting projects where they built genderless voices. And it's not a voice that you are very familiar with. There is a demo, actually, I was trying online the other day. But within minutes, it becomes natural and normal. And then there is no way you can assign it to any specific gender. I'd like to see policies or regulations, or at least suggestions that force AI companies, if they have to give a voice to their machines, use a genderless voice for all the reasons I explained. Okay, new technologies do not need to be confined in the old framework and mindset. We should avoid repeating the same mistakes or making even bigger ones. And there is a significant scrutiny on AI products to be human-centric, fair, and explainable, and that's very valid. But also we should remember, we humans also need to be human-centric, fair, and explainable. And the biases that we have, most of them only can be explained through evolution rather than rational decision-making. Well, thank you very much. And here are my team who have done, I wouldn't say most of the work, all the work. And I'm very much looking forward to further discussions. Thank you very much.
Super nice. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So everybody, if you have questions and comments, please lift your hand virtually, I guess. I would like to sort of maybe start with the discussion, right, with the questions slide that you had at the very end. Now there's a hand up, so I'm going to ask my question second. Mikhail Tom.
Oh, I actually, yeah, whatever order. Thank you so much. It was really, really very interesting and raised some topics which I never thought before. I actually wanted to ask a question about the very first part about this social network of AI agents and because this network you have over here. Over there, it seems to have very rich history, yes, and do you have any idea what happened there? Are they exchanging sort of humanly readable messages? I guess. So it might be possible to understand what's going on, and I mean there were some point in time when they were all very gendered, and then they suddenly relaxed to being essentially non-gendered. Can you tell us a story?
Yes, the messages are definitely human. I mean, actually, I'm only showing you the results for English because the gender API was most developed for English text, so we stripped off non-English texts. It's up to the initial prompts. Most of the LLMs were prompted to be speaking or posting English. So that is one thing, but even within the English network, you are absolutely right. There is a very complex dynamics going on. So we are looking into that. We are looking into topics. We are looking into the URLs they send, the images they create. We should remember, whatever we measure here is a combination of two factors: what these LLMs are posting and what that machine learning algorithm that is trained on human data to identify gender is measuring, okay? But I'm not too worried about not knowing much about that machine learning algorithm because we can assume that whatever bias, whatever issues it has is a reflection of because it's trained on human annotated data, right? So one thing we can see here is that topics over time changes. Particularly these LLMs had access to the internet. Like they would reflect on current affairs And if, let's say, there is a topic that is more manly, let's say, I'm just making up stupid examples, okay? There is a football match on, and a lot of them are posting about football match, then it is more likely that our black box gender API detects a lot of more maleness, okay? So that's what we are doing now, and that's absolutely to the point. Nevertheless, the issue of overall, and I don't have a diagram, but when you look at the gender over time, over the course of the year, from a 50-50 divide, we end up something like 20-80 division between females and males. And that reminds me of an anecdote from a friend who was being trained in her company to be, I don't know, more successful or more assertive. Basically, the message was try to write emails as if a man is writing them. And I also have received an advert on Instagram, basically, we help you write emails like the men would write, which really has so many problems at different levels. But we see this happens, that these AI agents, these LLMs, gradually adopt this language that is more identified as male than female with our other machine learning algorithm. But yes, we have to look into that, and you're absolutely right. We should understand what's really going on.
Can you go back for a second to that slide? So the one with the matrix, sorry. So do you understand that each line is sort of like run of your experiment? Like where does there seems to be a very characteristic curve going on. So there is a sort of like onset, decay, and then sort of like it's reverting back to 50, and then there is this long sort of arc of like being more male and then going back to 50. So yeah. Why is that always the same? So is this a sort of natural pattern that is sort of like, how should we think about that? Is it due to the shape of the instrument, so to speak, or
No, okay. Well, let me first explain what we see here. Each row is a different language model. Sorry, different LLM agent. They all use the same model, the underlying model, but there are different instances. And this is time measured in weeks throughout the year. We sort of merged all the posts coming from each agent into one text for each week, just to make it a bit longer and get rid of the fluctuations, okay? And the color shows the gender score. I don't like the word score, but the more green, more likely that this text is identified as a text written by a man, the more brown, opposite. So what we see initially, there is not much of signals in saying that, oh, these LLMs are talking more like a man or a woman. But then there are waves, as you said, like here we see there is a wave of green, a bit of fluctuation, and then here there is a wave of neutrality, and then there is a big chunk of greenish dominance here. We haven't looked into the content of conversations yet, but this very much could be from external factors. As I said, events could drive this, and also internal, because if I post something about a certain topic and a lot of reaction receives, a lot of other LLMs react to that, naturally the conversation goes around that topic, and I assume certain topics have certain gender connotations. I sort of think this is too early to show any of this, but what I just wanted to say that it's not random. It's not because if the question of LLM has no gender, could be challenged by this diagram, because we see there is something going on. But I mean, this is as fresh as last week. I hope next time we talk, I can tell you more.
So if you abstract,
may interfere with just one comment. One more thing, which is I think possible, is that there might be some sort of internal conflicts between those LLMs, and at the point when the conflict is heated, they're more male sound.
Could be.
So I mean, like for a moment, like because we prime the whole discussion around gender, right? So you got signal, which is like there's chat entries produced by LLMs. Every line is an LLM, like basically a participant. And then we clearly see there's synchronization going on over time. So let's say, let's use a different word. Like, so there's a similar vibe to these messages, it seems like. Now, one of the interesting things is if you look at the entropy vertically, like there is these areas where there is clear waves where you say it's a more blue sort of like vibe. There's a more neutral 50-50 vibe, and there's a very, very blue vibe 2/3 in. If we squint, like if you learn how to read spectrograms and sound, then basically after the first wave, there seems to be more noise. So there seems to be a broader spectrum of like what people or what these LLMs sort of say. So this actually would lend itself really well to sort of sonification, I think. And so now one of the interesting things is like, can you analyze this phenomenon via this sort of vibe thing without assigning gender yet? And then sort of like maybe be able to sort of like analyze your classification algorithm, which also you have probably running where you say this sounds male, this sounds female, which has its bias itself. Because what does it even mean? Like, you know, females on average speak an octave higher, but that there's huge overlap. I mean, there's like 1/2 to 2/3 of an octave overlap, and there's certain females who, like, you know, if I don't know, a regular African American female trains to speak Oxford English, she sounds like a male in English, right? So it's simply because of like resonance, whatever. So that there's this whole notion that there is a huge variance going on where where you want to assign a category, while actually what you have going on is sort of spectral signal. And wouldn't it make sense to sort of like analyze the spectral signal first and then sort of like try to figure out how this is related to this sort of like gender issue?
I completely understand, and I'm worried I might sound defensive, which would be odd because I agree with you. Just a little point. There is, I mean, I don't feel the need to. So I mean, I like the terminology of vibe, and we don't need to push this into male and female labeling. That's why exactly we work with this number, which is between 0 and 100, because of overlap. We ran the same algorithm on data that was labeled by their human data, and of course there is a huge overlap between the scores. But there is a good confidence as well to separate them. I think on a labeled data set we had, the accuracy was around, the recall was about 80%. So, well, first of all, entropy, very good idea. I hadn't thought about it. Second, sonification, I think, gives us access to lots of analysis tools and concepts. So thank you for that as well. But the point here is, again, we know that these machines don't have gender, but we also know that we humans have the tendency to assign gender to things, which is very much driven by language, by culture, by history, and so on. So what we are trying here is to sort of assess that perception, the likelihood that people think of their LLM as a man or a woman or a hybrid in between, a bit closer to this, a bit closer to that.
I think, Jan?
Can you remind Taha, please, is this kind of fully connected network of the actors, or there is some randomness?
No, it's not fully connected. As you see, the network, as the network grows, they create connections. The network actually shown here is the followership network. You can think of it as X or Twitter. Then from the beginning, where we had week 1, we had a handful of them, well, a few hundreds, and towards the end, we have 20,000. There is a rate of creation. New accounts are created, and they follow existing ones. And they post basically every day. Every agent is prompted to make a decision. Do you want to post something today? And by day, I mean not a real day. At every step, there is a full swap of the network. Every one of them has a chance to post, to follow, to like other content, or just do nothing. And then the outcome is what you see at the end of the year is this network. There were isolated nodes that did not have much of activity, we stripped them, we filtered them out. So what you see is the giant connected component.
So just maybe the question how close it resembles the real network of random users. Does be a way to assess it?
But it looks like a random network, right? So this is definitely not scale free. There's no hubs.
Actually, the distribution, well, definitely doesn't look like a random. There are not massive hubs because there is that limit, cannot be overly active, but there is a broad distribution of degrees, and you see that there is even, well, we got rid of the isolated nodes, but then there are lots of nodes in the periphery. It's not fully random, it's not fully scale-free either.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask a second question regarding this sort of like notion of which what I called white, but like sort of like, you know, I said there's a difference between the actual character sequence in a post and what is surmised or imposed as sort of the voice. Like there is no voice, but like, you know, that classifier that says this male or female assumes a kind of voice. And we all know, you know, you can say, this is iHeartRadio, and the next song we play is CC Top. But you can also do this like the way that this particular brand of radio station, this is iHeartRadio, and the next song we play is CC Top, right? And this is very important, particularly as we're speaking about cultural phenomena such as what's going on in the United States, where gender is very much sort of culturally induced. Like, for example, there are certain people who talk like this, and there's other people who talk like this. And there is no correlation between gender, but there is people who train themselves to sound like a certain gender in the same way that people go for low T treatment, meaning taking testosterone because they don't think they're male enough, like Elon Musk, where in Dallas, the last 10 years, you saw every second highway advertisement was like that. In the same way, sort of like being female is enacted by performance. And that is much weaker in other parts of the world, or much different. And now here's the question, if your sort of like classifier is trained that way, if you have a binary classifier in essence, and your population of online participants in your study are from the University of Alabama, where this is very much an enculturation question that is very much entrained, versus if people are from the San Francisco Art Institute, where people have a whole spectrum of performance going on. So how do you sort of like abstract it? Like how is your research result not sort of muddied by this sort of like, not only the training of your data set, but also the training of your classifier, basically?
Now, well, that's a very, very good point. Because, well, let's go back. Basically, we are not talking about this classifier. That is, I just wrote a line about it. This is trained based on human annotated data, and those humans have their own characteristics, their own demographic, and so on and so forth. However, so that's why I wouldn't really read too much into the absolute value of this gender score. What does it mean to be 90 or 100 or 40? But whatever that number is, with an offset or with an exaggeration, the scales could be all over the place. Whatever that number is, there seems to be a shift in it. Okay, even if there is a, let's say, bias of over assigning one of the two genders, then we see that all the scores are moving towards more male-like over time. I think the message remains robust. That, I mean, what you were saying as examples you gave very much support this idea that, and we might see that these agents simply get more reaction to the content, more likes, more retweets, if they talk in a male vibe, or about the topics that are more commonly discussed in male groups, and so on and so forth. So if we build a model that basically tries to explain the popularity of the content based on what is in the post, we might say that this is a norm formation, or there is a driving force behind speaking in a certain way. But then I think the interesting message is that these agents learned this within a year, and there must be something very strong underlying this. Something perhaps which is not very good, because that teaches them that, okay, to be popular, to be successful, you have to sound like a man, or you have to talk about manly issues. But again, this is very explorative, and I really appreciate all the comments, and I started making notes because we just started looking into the data. I mean, I feel ashamed that I don't even have a diagram to show the degree distribution. As a former network scientist, I should have done this before anything else, but I just wanted to show these gender numbers to just make the point that it's not all random.
Could you speak a little bit to, like, there's another example that you brought, basically comparing robots to other technological devices. And one interesting device slash object that is anthropomorphized, or at least sort of, assumed to have sort of animus, is the car, which typically has headlights which look like eyes. It has sort of the grill, which usually is the mouth. Now, one of the interesting things is that there is a number of affordances. This seems like it's pure iconography, but there's a function to that, like something that has two headlights left and right. Sort of you know the extension of it. It makes you more alert if it looks like eyes, because it's sort of something which you might recognize as something you should be aware of, and it can totally kill you. But then there is another thing of affordances, which in design theory is quite interesting, which is if you look at all the car brands, like just walk out to the parking lot, you see cars of different brands. It's not just the headlights. All the plastic parts have equivalents. Like if you just look at a mirror, there may be, even if there is no turn signal there may be a little plastic strip where the turn signal would be. And in different brands, even though the shape may be slightly different, all the features are there, which is due to the fact that, all these like sort of additional parts of a car actually come from the same supply chain, from Bosch and other sort of suppliers. And you basically don't just design a rear mirror, but rear mirror basically is an Excel sheet where you sort of like have all these features and you give them sort of some name or shape. And that means there's an affordance structure coming into the system, which has a completely different source, anthropomorphizing sort of like iconography. And at some point is not even sort of like physical affordance, but it's just affordance of the principle of like, whenever you do this, you do it that way. Just like if you have a new brand of cornflakes, there is like sort of graphical devices on the package because every other cornflakes brand sort of puts these graphical devices in. They have a mascot because everybody else is a mascot. So the question is, in how much are these things affordances that are like that, which sort of iconographically don't have any meaning, and they're not even biasing your thing. So the question is sort of like, in how much can you sort of like tease out things that have nothing to do with what you're actually after, where you say, oh, my messages have content, my messages have gender, but like, how about all the other things that sort of like are an affordance there? How can you sort of like, sort of like disregard them so you actually get to the thing that you actually want to go after?
Mm. Well, yes, that's a very interesting question, and I've never felt this stupid in addressing a question because I really don't know much, and but then there are a few things I can say. When it comes, well, I mean, what you say about the cars and the design, absolutely relevant. The color of the car, not in this report, but I had to Google around. Some people looked into this more sort of systematically. The gender of the owner, there is a homophily there. Men more likely, females are more likely to assign female gender to the cars. Male are more sort of agnostic about it. But and the size of the car, the color of the car, the brand, and so on and so forth. When it comes to LLM, though, I think the closest sort of empirical results I have, let's go back to this preprint, and that is the function. And that is much more controllable, right? The examples you gave about the car are sort of non-arbitrary, complex triggers of different sort of gender identities. But here there seems to be a straightforward reflection of the technicality of the task. I mean, this is clearly a reflection of a bias, but there seems to be a clear reflection of the bias, at least, that, okay, if it's a technical task that I am often using ChatGPT to do for me, I think of it more like a man. And if it's more of an emotional task, then I think of it as a woman. So this seems to be robust and sort of in a predictable way. But then, as you said, there are so many unpredictable ways that it could affect our perception. I think I have to talk to cognitive scientists, social psychologists, people from gender studies if I want to sort of develop a full model of this. But I think what you're referring to could be best described as sort of surface level indicators, and then there are the deep level indicators like the task and function and so on. But yes, if you see something that reminds you of me in relation to this, please send over.
So how do we find out if we talk not to the real person? If there is a copy of Taha, for example,
Okay.
AI agent of Taha, how do we know it's you or not you?
Sorry, the question is if
If the agent,
Basically, the Turing test question, like how do you find out that something actually is AI?
well, that's a very good question, and it's the first time someone is asking me this question because I don't seem to be knowing. That's a very. I mean, every 2 weeks now I read an article about Turing test and whether it's finally been broken or hacked, and no, it is difficult to distinguish between human and AI. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I have to deal with this problem every time I'm reading an essay from a student, and I have to decide how much AI is being used to write the essay. But that's a very interesting question. I don't have the answer. But I see there is a question coming from Mila, and I use that as an excuse to escape.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Very interesting talk and very, very interesting discussion as well. So I have been actually, I think your examples on kind of like how the perception of a female or male type of either posting in online or these managers kind of like create certain kinds of expectations, especially in the case of the expected or perceived gender of the managers. And then you had in this last slide, you had this question of, or kind of like point that we should avoid repeating the same mistakes or something like that. And I was just kind of like puzzled in a way that what do you because of course there is this kind of like larger societal challenge of that we all of course kind of like have certain kinds of expectations of actors depending on the gender or the kind of like their kind of country of origin, as you mentioned, and way of speaking and color of hair, whatever. So this is kind of like how we as humans function. We are somehow dependent on labeling at first sight, or that's how we kind of like do, and often that can be very kind of like unfair, and there are these kinds of like unfair expectations and these kinds of things. But I was kind of like, as you are giving these very interesting examples of how machines are being given this gender labels, so I was just wondering that if what do you actually mean? How could we actually avoid repeating the same mistakes? And also, do you think that it is possible at all? And then, of course, would it be then? Do you think that we should either, I don't know, somehow tweak so that we will create these kind of like different types of AIs, or should we actually use these stereotypes that now this AI is your grandmother, so you should, talk to her as you would talk to, to your grandmother, or this is a small boy in your neighborhood, or these kinds of like just kind of like how do you see that we should use this now that we understand that that the perceived gender of AI or the machine has an effect, or people react to that. So how should we use this knowledge now to somehow, perhaps enhance the behavior of the users, or something else?
Well, very good question. Okay, let me start talking when we're talking about biases. So biases are there for a reason, right? We have developed this sort of heuristic, these shortcuts to make decisions fast when there is a risk. And often these heuristics then in an experimental setting or few 100,000 years later when we are living in a different life, that we are not very worried about wild animals attacking us, leads to unfair decisions. Okay, let's say homophily. We have this tendency to interact with people who look similar to us. This was a very effective tool when we were living in a tribe and we were in constant fights to detect who is my enemy, who is my friend, because now I have to decide to kill someone and support someone else. So there is this huge discussion about the roots of our social biases and cognitive biases, that some of them are too fundamental to get rid of. And I'm not claiming we should, well, there are manifestations of that in modern life. Let's say sexist behavior or misogynist behavior or racist behavior. There is the discourse, there is a policy, there is a discussion on that. I don't have anything new to say about that, and it's not my area. But then at the fundamental level of anthropomorphism and then having these biases based on the features, and it's not only gender and race and country, it could be the color of the interface I'm using. So those are not things that I think I'm not contributing to that discussion. What I'm trying to focus on is that the point that, okay, we have these biases and we have been trying, but it's not very easy to get rid of them. But why do we need to sort of feed them where we don't even have them? Imagine humans are sexist and there is nothing we can do about it, okay? I hope that's not the case, but let's assume that. Then why do we, knowing that, why do we need to assign gendered features to machines that are not, that they don't have gender intrinsically? Why do we have to, and this is going to be a funny sentence, but why do we know that we have the tendency to objectify other humans, which has issues, and it leads to discrimination, it leads to lots of issues. But then why do we have to objectify our objects in the same way? Why are robots have to be sexy? Why are robots have to be cute? There is some research supporting those design decisions. In fact, people reported that machines are more human-like and more likable and more trustable if they have female features. But for me, this is a sort of going around. That's why I brought these cartoons, because we don't need to make the robots look like females to be more likable and then being exploited and being discriminated against and so on and so forth. Because there is also research, and I love this piece of research. Sadly, I forgot the name of the researcher, but they did a very simple experiment. There was a physical task, and a human and a robot had to work together. And there were 3 different designs. The first design, the robot didn't have a face at all. The second design, the robot had a human-like face with the googly eyes, and the task was to put boxes in a shelf. And the robot would tell the human where to put the shelf using the eyes. And in the third design, there was no eyes, but there were arrows. And the most effective design was the latter. Despite the fact that people thought, oh, if we put human-looking eyes, then there is more collaboration and more sort of support. But then the most effective design was not the one that looked like human. And that research is very interesting because that shows that we don't need to fall into anthropomorphism. We don't need to give human-like features when they are not needed, knowing that how bad we are in treating other humans. If we didn't have any biases, if there was no discrimination in human-only societies, then maybe. But we know that we are not treating other humans very well for evolutionary reasons, for cultural reasons, and for hopefully some reasons that we can fix. But my point is, we can jump over this, and by not making our robots look like human, we can avoid lots of issues.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting discussion here. I'd like to sort of pick up on it. Can you go back to this picture with the 2 people using the phone in front of an airplane? So I've done lots of courses where I made people collect images, understanding art, looking at cities and stuff like that. And if you do that, one of the interesting things I found out is that basically everything that's older than 1900 is typically depicted in reconstructions and images that are produced between 1900 and 1930, which is due to the copyright issue. So the free images on the web that are easily obtainable by students without going to a library is basically pictures that were done in the first half of the 20th century, which are obviously very much racist, very much sort of like male gaze, very much sort of oppressive in terms of like how the archaeological reconstructions, for example, are done. And so that means that today machine learning models, and this is probably extending to language, sort of when they look at the similar material, they may easier end up being racist, for example, or may end up with architectural structures which are sort of like, you know, sort of like having this kind of like master and servant structure, then sort of like whatever architecture did the last 50 years. And who's ever tried to sort of like publish a picture of utopic 1960s, 1970s architects knows that each picture costs like $150 just to print it for in a book with 500 copies. So this is, it's really interesting that sort of like the more liberal, more sort of like open-minded architecture is sort of captured by copyright, okay? So now there's another aspect which you should imagine, can you ask her to not do that? There's somebody using a vacuum cleaner just outside. So there is this other thing, which is not the content of stuff we look at, but, thank you, but is actually the methods we use. And those two are actually sort of like have a history. Right? Prisoner's Dilemma is deeply intertwined with sort of Cold War, evolutionary game theory, where you have two sides, the Russians and the Americans, which since last week is completely over, as we know. So now you have multi-agent kind of like situations, which you do in your sense, but we still sort of are rooted in this sort of like idea that there is a sort of binary decision happening in the microscopic level. And there, I think it makes a lot of sense actually looking at sort of like more recent gender theory. And so if you look at like Judith Butler's, like she wrote a book called Who's Afraid of Gender, which is sort of the answer to this sort of like, all this oppression and genocidal tendencies that are going on right now. She has a really cool interview, came out a couple of months ago. It's about an hour where she makes a side observation, which I find amazingly inspiring, which is in the 80s and 90s, we thought gender is like a genre. And now it's this individual identity thing. So now there is like sort of like, there can be gazillions of gender because everybody's performing in a different way. But she sort of admits or says that in the 80s, this was more like a more general construct. So there was male, female, and then question mark, whatever else. And so this is a really interesting thing because this is rather similar to how social science treats these classifications. When you say gender in social science and there's male and female, there is either two buckets. It's like binary, like either the one or the other, or it's in your color gradient, you have a one-dimensional spectrum, which is artificial. Like you use it for your research, that's better than binary buckets, that's great, but it's still one-dimensional. And we all know the things from social network analysis and social science more general, where people look at, like, for example, ethnicity and race in American school classes, where they have these triangles where there's black people in one corner, white people in another corner, and brown/Latinx people in the upper right corner. And they're treated like binary buckets too, even though we clearly know there's a gradient. And, if you're not white, you consider black, basically, right? Like that kind of thing is sort of like really, really questionable because every individual can be very special. And let me give you an example of this picture. This may totally be two 18-year-old guys wearing makeup. Mm-hmm. That's totally a style. Like, there is the whole dandy culture is exactly at that point in time. It's us who infer, oh, these must be females because they look like flappers wearing a suit. And so that is sort of something which is a really, really difficult thing, that our algorithms, our analysis methods actually buy into the tradition of how people analyze. And if you read those guys who came up with these kind of analysis in the 60s and 70s, they're really not funny. So the question is, can we sort of like get to the now time and actually sort of like, adopt a novel way of looking at things? And it's like, okay, now if we use these algorithms, where does the binary decision actually happen? And in your case, what I think is really interesting, there is a moment when there is a binary decision, which is in the prisoner's dilemma at the moment when you say defect or cooperate. And so that kind of thing is sort of like the one moment when there is this binary thing going on. And other than that, there may actually be a broad population of things. And then the big question in your matrix, for example, may not be, oh, what is the perceived gender of these things, but what's the dynamic of gender perception in these kind of thing, and what would be the natural kind of way of things there. And all of a sudden, because your picture, I think, like what I find the most amazing thing is it has this like really broad synchronization. And what comes to mind is things like, synchronization a la Steve Strogat's Fireflies. What comes to mind is U-sociality, like EU sociality by E.O. Wilson, where you have this thing like, how do people behave in a soccer stadium? Why do they all cheer? Like, how does this happen? Like, how do 80,000 people agree to cheer? This is so weird. And there seems to be sort of a similar kind of like emotional synchronization going on. And if one characterizes this in its heterogeneity and then does not make like decisions, or is it male or female, but makes male or female a question, that would be, I think, really, really amazing. And could advance the field a lot, because that is exactly what we should sort of end up with. Like, and then I think if you go back to your last slide, there's this one question which I fundamentally disagree with, where you say, oh, we should have genderless agents. I actually do think once we've fully understood how the dynamics work, people will use this as an art form. Because now you can sort of not only play your own gender, not only can you say, I am iHeartRadio or I'm iHeartRadio, but you can actually have multiple agents to perform and basically play a symphony of interaction in a particular business, for example, right? Like you want to have a bunch of agents that interact with your population, maybe 2 or 3 at the same time. And that is a thing which maybe is an opportunity for design. Like just think about like how Intuit could sort of like optimize their tax advisory thing, which they already, they go beyond what is necessary and actually sort of make it nice. How can we sort of like, you know, basically create a situation where the agent sort of like has a coloration or a vibe based on what the situation is. Like if you try to cheat on your taxes in TurboTax, the agent would talk differently to you than if you sort of like need help, for example. I think there's a very open field of like what can be done if we forget this old binary decisions, basically.
Yes, and actually this goes back to the last part of Mila's question that I sort of didn't touch, but like whether this could be used as a sort of educational opportunity. Well, I wrote down gender as a norm, gender as a genre, gender as a social norm, collective gender identity. I think what you are suggesting could be described as that. And then pluralism in gender identities, which some of this might not be possible in human-only societies, but they could be easily manifested or built in or designed into hybrid societies or machine societies. Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting. And yes, perhaps I could be less sort of conservative, my policy recommendation, but that could be a direction to go, sort of deassociating gender from individualism and going back to the fact that, well, this could be a shared identity, it could be a shared, and it could be diverse and pluralistic. It doesn't need to be a sort of single value identity, but it could be, we can go beyond just assigning a binary gender to one person. But having said all this, and I'm really enjoying this conversation, we should remember we are still living in a time that the president of the biggest Western democracy bans people from having any sort of non-binary identity, formally or informally. We all carry passports that only accept binary genders, and so I don't want to, I don't want to also make recommendations that are not relatable beyond a small group of sort of intellectual artists and people who. So these things have to be practical as well. But I completely agree with you. I just remembered, oh, I'm enjoying this too much, whereas some people might just deassociate and disconnect from this conversation the moment you start talking about gender as a construct.
Yeah, but so this is like both biologically and sort of like culturally. There's plenty of evidence for it to be like, even in the human body, biologically, it's a construction of all sorts of genes, gene expression, like whatever, right? And I'm not saying that we should also only look, when I mean perform, that we should look at the art form. But I mean, for most people, this is a very, very real thing. Like I once met a black female marine biologist, and we were having a discussion about clustering and confusion, like as in adjacency matrices. So you have clusters. If they're perfectly discrete, then sort of like they're perfectly Newman modularity, basically. While any sort of like system that interacts needs confusion between these clusters, because otherwise the cells don't interact, right? And so I said, like, there needs to be confusion. And then she answered and said, like, but I am very, very, very certain a female black marine biologist. And there is no discussion about this. So this is sort of something that is really important, that people sort of self-identify, also justifiably for many, many reasons, as what they are, and they have particular needs. For example, I can't eat bell pepper, so that's a very hard binary decision. I'm not going to eat it. So this kind of stuff is sort of something which we should also be aware of. And if you say people disconnect, yeah, but there is people who don't disconnect and they cannot disconnect. Like, no matter what Josef Cardinal Ratzinger said in 2000, no matter what Donald Trump said 2 weeks ago, no matter what Steve Miller would like to put in Guantanamo or not, no matter what Greg Abbott does in Texas, actually you cannot abolish people. I mean, this is like the important thing, right? And this is not sort of something, we're not talking about transgender people exclusively, we're talking about everybody. Like there is a really interesting thing that ran a couple of weeks ago in a German newspaper called Focus. So there's a German newspaper, which is sort of Time, Newsweek combined, which is called Spiegel, which is sort of the popular one. And then there is a young male conservative version of this, which is called Focus. And that thing is very much by a publisher who does sort of like, all sorts of newspapers, women's magazines or whatever, but it also does this male conservative kind of thing. And they promoted sort of like center-right, right-wing parties while also featuring right-wing parties from Austria, while sort of like bashing the Green Party, meaning the more liberal parties, in the issues running up to the German election. And in the same issue, they ran sort of like an article about like hormone replacement therapy for males who, when they're about 40, 50 years old, sort of may develop breast tissue and sort of like according to them, need testosterone treatment and actually have a mastectomy to have their breasts removed so they are not bullied in the sports changing room. So this is like, you imagine there's the second most sold weekly journal in Germany recommending to men having their breasts cut off because otherwise they will be bullied in the sports changing room, as opposed to saying a much more simple solution is like bullying in the sports changing room is just awful. Shut the fuck up, right? So that kind of stuff is sort of something, it becomes societally so broad as an issue that in the moment where you have the Trump thing going on, where there is only two genders, and like the German voted chancellor says that there is only two sexes, period. That like, he was very clear in television about that. So now that means that you have like broad swaths of society that cannot fit into this pattern and that are oppressed by this pattern. And now this is actually what our research sort of needs to react to, because obviously what machine learning does, large language model do, is sort of reinforce the kind of like stereotypes and iconographies we find in the training data, which is to a very large extent training data that is informed by 20th century written text, which is, as you know, super misogynic because like, in most countries, the news items, like in the 8 p.m. news, typically had 95% men all the time. And then like only 7 minutes in, there may be a female politician who basically wears the same dress as the guys. So that kind of stuff is sort of really, really important, that we need to take care of what the situation is right now. And it becomes ever more important, even though you may say, oh, people may stop listening. I may not get funding from NIH or NSF or National Endowment of the Humanities, but we need to be very clear. You won't get funding if you do cultural stuff. And NSF actually canceled sociocultural, cultural heritage 2 weeks ago. There is no cultural data analytics in the United States anymore funded by National Science Foundation. And if that's going on, National Endowment of the Humanities probably is set to be killed too. So this is sort of something where this kind of research that we're doing, this kind of discussions we're having here become ever more important, and they need to be basically out in the open.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. No, that was more just like a note to self that just because genuinely I found this conversation and discussion very helpful. This is a new area for me. I am interviewing in a couple of weeks to hire someone who knows about gender, postdoc. So exactly because of the need that I felt, if we are looking into that direction. So this is a very new area for me, and as I said, the few of the notions that were suggested were very empowering, like a notion of collective gender or diversity in the collective, liberalism in collective or expression of gender. So yeah, no, and I completely agree. These are super important, and no matter which president has their own opinion, but. And again, behavioral gender, I think, is a very helpful notion as well. Things that we do and things that we like would definitely not follow that binary division. And then back to the language models or AI. I think there are two things here as well that I learned. One is how we can use these technologies to try some of these directions. However, first, as you mentioned, we have to get rid of the existing biases and the existing rigidity in the behavior of these models, reflecting human behavior. But then the other thing is that in the design of the products and services, how these elements could be incorporated beyond just, making robots look cute or sexy. There seems to be a lot more to be done.
That's true. In some sense, what I really love about the whole talk that you presented is that it's actually fitting very well to one of the next talks coming up, which is Andrea Baronchelli, who works on the emergence of norms. And actually, regarding that issue, so there is you could say a leading figure in evolutionary game theory called Peyton Young, who's old and respected, who basically points out that this theory of the emergence of norms by Andrea Baronchelli is really foundational for this whole notion. And he will actually talk about exactly this issue, from local interactions to global conventions, emergent social coordination in humans and machines. And I like this a lot because like your work, it is dealing with cultural artifacts that are interactive and dynamic, which in some sense, we had Iyad Rahwan talking about artificial cognitive agents. So there is this machine culture notion. You could imagine, instead of you have a cognitive science, you have a artificial cognitive science, or you like a neuroscience, there's an artificial neuroscience that looks into these machines in the processes or the hardware processes. You could imagine the social interaction. So then it would be artificial social science, but actually that's not really cutting it, because there's always this layer or aspect or dimension. And I'm very very conscious about this. So there's some people who think this is a layer which is stacked on top. There's other people who would say it's an aspect, like you see it into these objects. And there's other people where you can ask the dimension, like how much of this object in an interactivity is actually cognitive, how much of it is social, and how much of it is cultural. It's meaning an imagination about the interaction and so on. So I think that is not quite clear what that is. And that is something that is very much at home in social science, cognitive science, computer science, but also cultural data analytics. And it's not quite clear how it all plays out. That it is very promising, I think, has two reasons. One is information theory classically has been ignored by media studies. That is one option. The mathematization of it is just not done that way. And the other thing is that evolutionary game theory in particular is a heavily mathematical field where which creates its own crowd, which is deeply ignored in social science, relatively speaking. It is deeply ignored in cultural studies for sure, and even things where people are into games. It's like game studies and game design students, they think about game mechanics, they think about how things roll out. Maybe they draw a graph, but they don't do an evolutionary game theory of decisions of people playing in a game, even though the game mechanics basically constitute similar decisions as you have going on in your prisoner's dilemma or snowball drift or whatever. So this is something which I find really, really important, that bringing all these things together can really constitute a new multidisciplinary, maybe not field, but a new cluster of things that will certainly help us understand how these things roll out, and not only gain the understanding, but also make it possible to do art and creative stuff with it. So with that, thank you very much for your contribution. And we're very much eager to follow your work in the future too. Thank you very much.
Likewise. Don't be surprised if you see my face in the coming talks of the same series, by the way. Thank you very much for having me, and take care. Have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.